I'm Nora Hayes, 29 years old, and the steam from the turkey I roasted curls into the quiet like a question no one wants to answer. The dining room is dressed the way my mother likes it, lace runner, polished silver, the antique clock ticking from the living room I paid to repair in September. My father sits at the head of the table, carving a slice he didn't baste. My mother rearranges green beans she hasn't touched, and my sister watches the condensation slide down her water glass as if it can tell her the truth. A promotion at work had me smiling an hour ago. Now the room feels tight at the edges, as if the walls have shifted in a way only I can feel. Every light burning over our heads runs through my online account, and the insurance card in my wallet is the reason my mother hasn't missed her appointments. I noticed the chair where we kept an empty place one year for a relative who couldn't make it, and I think how strange it is that we leave room for absence in this house but not for gratitude. The knife pauses over the casserole I made, and I set my fork down because I already know what happens when a person clears his throat right before the blessing. I've cooked, I've paid, I've tried to make it all easier, but the quiet that follows doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the breath taken just before a match is struck. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to carry a household no one would admit you were holding together. I grew up in this same 3-bedroom house on a quiet street where mailboxes lean a little after winter and neighbors still wave from their porches when the trash truck rattles by. My parents taught us practical things: wipe your feet, say, thank you, don't borrow what you can't return. And I believed for a long time that those rules, if followed faithfully, kept a family steady. I learned to stretch a dollar by watching my mother plan meals and listening to my father talk about pride and paying your way, even when the numbers didn't cooperate. We weren't wealthy, but birthdays meant homemade cakes, and summers meant car rides with the windows down and radio stations that faded to fuzz between towns. In those years, I kept a small jar in my closet where I saved tip money and holiday cash proof to myself that I could create a cushion, even if it was only $20 bills folded into quarters. After college, I stayed close because it felt like the right thing to do. My job pays reliably, not extravagantly, and I've always been the kind of person who shows up early, answers emails on time, and brings the extra charger to meetings. When my mother lost her position at the dental office, the numbers we used to discuss in passing came to live with us at the kitchen table: due dates, minimums past due, stamps that left a blush of red on envelopes like a warning. One by one, the accounts moved into my name because the late fees were louder than our pride electricity, so the fridge stayed on water so the laundry could run internet because Megan's classes required it. The insurance card became mine as well, and I kept it in a small sleeve in my wallet separate from my own card so I wouldn't pull the wrong one at a pharmacy window. There is a difference between helping and holding, and I didn't recognize it at first. Helping is a meal dropped off after surgery or a ride to an appointment. Holding is the weight of an entire month balanced on your paycheck while you tell yourself it's only temporary. I deep cleaned the oven the week I replaced the refrigerator, and I fixed the Wi-Fi when it blinked out during Megan's exam. I started buying groceries on Sundays, and when the clerk asked if I wanted paper or plastic, I wanted to say I needed something stronger than either to keep all of this together. I kept the receipts in a shoebox because it felt organized, and organization felt like control, even if control was mostly an illusion by then. The house itself taught me about contrasts I didn't expect. In one room, my mother's planner lay open with notes about appointments. In another, my father's fishing magazines were stacked under the end table beside a travel mug that always smelled faintly of coffee. The difference between what we could afford and what we pretended we could manage widened quietly like a hairline crack in a window that only becomes obvious when the morning light catches it. I put my name on the accounts and told myself it was the quickest way to make the calls to stop the cycles of shutoffs and reconnect fees to protect Megan from studying by flashlight. The day the antique clock returned from the repair shop ticking evenly again, after years of silence, my mother smiled and said, "The house sounded alive." I didn't say out loud that the invoice had my address printed at the top. When my manager called me into his office 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I thought for a second that something had gone wrong because good news sometimes arrives sounding like bad news. He told me they were moving me up a grade with a small raise, and I thanked him while mentally calculating co-pays and the utility budget the way you do when you carry numbers on your back. I drove home with a paper bag of takeout to celebrate, and by the time I turned into our driveway, I had already decided to pick up a pie from a bakery in town, something my mother used to buy in better years. I set the pie on the counter and watched condensation bead on the box, thinking about how steam rises and disappears, how you can hold something warm for a minute, and then only the plate remains. On Thanksgiving morning, the kitchen belonged to me from the first clatter of pans to the last rinse of the sink. I basted the turkey while the Macy's parade rolled on low in the background, and Megan handed me measuring cups the way she did when she was small. I made 3 sides because it felt like abundance, even if the math said otherwise, and I set the table with the good plates because tradition sometimes steadies a person more than food does. My mother adjusted the napkins so they pointed the same direction, and my father checked the score of the early game, and I told myself that keeping the pattern might be enough. By late afternoon, we were gathered in our usual spots, the clock steady in the next room, the cranberry sauce holding its shape on a small white dish. I passed the rolls and poured water, and when my mother asked about my week, I mentioned the promotion in the casual way people do when they don't want to make a big deal of it. Megan smiled and bumped my knee under the table, a small celebration that didn't need words, and I let myself believe the evening might pass in a gentle curve rather than a sharp turn. Then, my father set his fork down with a click that sounded louder than it should, cleared his throat, and said my name in a voice that made the room lean toward him. I looked up and met his eyes, and the knife hovering over the casserole stayed in the air, as if the meal and everything we'd been balancing was waiting to see which way it would fall. My fork was halfway to my mouth when my father's voice cut through the hum of the holiday table. "You're nothing but a leech," he said, his tone sharp enough to still every hand. For a moment, all I could hear was the antique clock ticking from the living room, steady and indifferent. The casserole on my plate looked suddenly strange, as if it belonged to someone else's dinner, not mine. Across the table, Megan froze with her glass of water suspended in her hand, while my mother stared down, nudging green beans across her plate without eating. The sting of the words wasn't softened by the setting. I had spent all morning basting the turkey whipping potatoes and setting the table while they watched the game. Just 20 minutes earlier, I'd told them about my promotion, smiling as though the effort of holding this house together hadn't cost me so much already. The bills in my name kept these lights on, filled the glasses at this table, and covered the doctor appointments my mother never missed. Yet now, as steam rose from the food I had paid for, I was being told I no longer belonged. I lifted my eyes toward my mother, hoping for something in her expression, but she wouldn't look at me. My father leaned back his jaw tight, as if waiting for me to argue. Instead, I placed my fork carefully on the edge of my plate and drew a breath that felt steadier than I expected. "I understand perfectly," I said. The words settled in the air, calm but final. His eyes narrowed, as if he couldn't quite make sense of my composure, but he didn't press. The silence stretched until my mother finally spoke, not to defend me, but to ask if I would still cover her insurance for the appointment she had next week. My answer was simple. Of course. I gathered a plate, and Megan's empty glass carried them to the kitchen and let the weight of the moment press down on me. The sink filled with running water as I rinsed away the remnants of dinner, each motion mechanical. Through the window, I could see my car in the driveway, the one thing that was entirely mine. At least I would have that when I left. Behind me, Megan set her plate beside the sink. She didn't meet my eyes, but her fingers brushed my wrist before she pulled away. It was the smallest gesture, but it was the only sign of solidarity I'd felt in weeks. Later that night, the clock on my nightstand read 1:18 as I folded another sweater into my suitcase. My body moved steadily, but my mind was racing, trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. I opened my desk drawer for the folder where I kept bills and receipts, ready to decide which ones I needed to take. Buried beneath them, I found a neat stack of bank statements bearing my father's name dated over the past few months. I hadn't seen a paper statement in years. Everything had been online since my mother lost her job, so curiosity pushed me to look closer. My stomach tightened as I scanned the balances. $4,000 in July, $5,000 in August, almost $7,000 by November. The numbers climbed while my savings shrank from $9,000 to less than $800. Beneath the statements lay a glossy brochure for a fishing boat, notes scrawled in my father's handwriting. Down payment, $500 circled in blue scheduled delivery after Thanksgiving, underlined twice. My hands shook as I sat on the edge of my bed piecing it together. While I worked extra shifts and ate ramen to stretch my budget, while I covered insurance and tuition needs, he had been saving for a boat. And it wasn't just the boat. A notepad revealed more due dates for utilities, my name followed by question marks and the words "after bills paid" underlined. They had planned this. They had waited until I carried the weight of November before showing me the door. A soft knock startled me, and the door opened just enough for Megan to slip inside. Her eyes darted to the boxes and open suitcases. "You're really leaving?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, slipping the bank statements into my purse. She lingered near the door as if ready to run if anyone came down the hall. "Mom said they need your room for storage now that Dad's buying that boat." The words struck like a physical blow. "Boat?" I asked. She nodded, her voice dropping. "I heard them planning weeks ago. They said they'd wait until after you paid November's bills." My breath caught as I looked at her. "You knew." She bit her lip, hard tears filling her eyes. "I was scared to tell you. Dad said if I warned you, I'd be next." Anger flared, but it dimmed when I saw her fear. She was still only 18, still learning how to live inside a house where silence was survival. Then she added something else, almost whispering. "Those appointments Mom's been having, the ones you've been paying for, they're not checkups. Last week she came home with her lips swollen. She told Dad she couldn't drink through a straw. It was fillers." The room tilted as her words sank in. I pulled up my bank app showing Megan the balance. $763. That's all I have left. 3 months ago, it was over $9,000. I looked at the receipts spilling from the shoebox proof of every bill, every purchase. If I'd stayed even one more month, there'd be nothing. Megan's voice wavered. "Dad said if you try to take anything, even stuff you bought, he'll report you for theft." I scanned the desk, the bookshelf, the bedding, all things I had purchased. My pulse quickened as she added, "He called the bank today to take your name off the utility accounts." I slid the shoebox onto the bed and began sorting. Receipts for the refrigerator, for Megan's laptop, for the carpet in the living room. Each one clipped to a credit card statement with my name clear at the top. In the middle of the night, surrounded by proof of betrayal, I found my only measure of control. Megan stood near the door, her face pale. "Nora," she whispered, "what would you do in my place if you had to choose between standing up for what's right and keeping peace in the only home you have?" I looked at her, at the fear and the longing in her eyes, and realized the answer wasn't simple. The choice I faced now would shape not just my life, but hers too, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if leaving quietly would be enough. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was on lunch break at my part-time job when my phone buzzed with a call from Aunt Phyllis. Her voice came through sharp and clipped each word, landing like a reprimand. "Honestly, Nora, I never thought you'd abandon your parents when they needed you most." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, my eyes fixed on the sandwich untouched in front of me. "Did Dad mention he told me to leave?" I asked, my voice level. She didn't answer directly. "He said you left them high and dry after a little disagreement," she said, heavy with disapproval. Then she added, "There's a family meeting at my house this weekend. We'll be discussing your behavior." I hung up before she could continue. The screen lit again almost immediately, this time with a text from a cousin asking how I could walk away after everything my parents had done for me. The thread of messages that followed carried the same tone: accusations, disappointment, assumptions, shaped by the story Gerald had already shared. Each notification sent a jolt through me, not just because of the words, but because of how quickly the narrative had turned against me. By Sunday, I had already moved the last of my boxes into Paige's apartment, stacking them in a corner beside the pull-out couch she'd offered. Everything I hadn't been able to carry fit inside my car downstairs, waiting like an anchor. I hadn't decided how to cut free. Drew hospital shifts left her coming and going at odd hours, while Lucas brought a steady hum of conversation when he wasn't working late. The couch was narrow, but it was mine without conditions. That night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by piles of documents, each one a thread tying me back to my parents' house. Utility bills, grocery receipts, insurance records, and the neat row of bank statements that proved how fast my savings had drained. Paige came home just after 10, tossing her hospital bag down and sliding onto the carpet beside me. "Operation Financial Freedom," she asked, a tired smile tugging at her lips. I nodded, tapping my pen against a notebook filled with account numbers. "Almost done. I've canceled the automatic payments, taken myself off the cell plan, and called to remove my name from their internet service." She leaned back against the couch, watching me work. "Good. They can figure out their own mess now." I wanted to agree, but the knot in my chest only tightened as I stared at the dwindling balance in my account. 3 months of covering every bill had left me with barely enough to think about first and last month's rent on my own place. The front door swung open, and Lucas stepped inside with his golden retriever bounding ahead. "Nora," he announced as the dog leapt into the room. "Meet Baxter, the world's worst therapist, but he works for treats." Baxter barreled across the carpet and dropped a slobbery tennis ball in my lap. His wet nose nudged my hand until I laughed the sound strange and unfamiliar after the week I'd had. Lucas grinned. "Told you. Works every time." The next morning, I was at Paige's kitchen table, scrolling through job postings that might offer a little more stability. My phone lit up with my mother's name. I considered sending it to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her tone. "What have you done?" she demanded the moment I answered. "The power's out, the internet's down, and my insurance was declined at the appointment." I drew a steady breath. I stopped paying for things that aren't my responsibility. Her voice wavered between panic and indignation. "You can't just leave us like this. We're your family." The words might have struck deep once, but now they fell flat. "Family doesn't call each other a leech at Thanksgiving dinner," I said, keeping my tone calm. She tried to soften it then. "Your father didn't mean it. You know how he gets." "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." Then I ended the call. That evening, Paige leaned over my shoulder as I reset passwords on my bank accounts and email. "You've had suspicious login attempts," she pointed out, nodding toward the alerts on the screen. "We should set up fraud protections." Her suggestion was practical, not intrusive, and I found myself grateful for how different it felt from the entitlement I'd grown used to. Later that night, I scrolled through apartment listings. Most were small studios, but each represented something I had never really owned before, a space completely mine where no one could tell me I didn't belong. The decision to search for a place felt like breathing air I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The next morning, I walked into a credit union nearby and opened a new account. The teller's voice was friendly as she slid the forms across the counter, unaware of how significant the moment felt. I transferred every remaining dollar into the new account, leaving behind the one my parents knew. As I walked out with the new account card tucked in my wallet, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. "Mom's looking for your banking info. Says she needs to check something. Don't trust her." I had barely finished reading when my phone lit with 6 missed calls, all from home. Almost at the same time, an email alert popped up, a fraud warning, password reset attempts on my banking app. My chest tightened as I gripped the phone, the realization settling heavy. They weren't just trying to guilt me back. They were trying to take what little I had left. By the next day, a representative from the bank confirmed it. "Ms. Hayes, we've blocked 3 separate reset attempts from your parents' home address in the last 24 hours. Her tone carried concern, but also a kind of validation I hadn't expected. "Your accounts are secure, but we've flagged them for enhanced protection. Any future changes will require you to show ID in person." When I hung up, I felt a small release in my chest. Each phone call I made to utilities, each confirmation from a representative, became a brick in a wall I was slowly building between myself and the life I had carried for too long. Not a wall of anger, though, that simmered beneath everything, but a wall of safety I hadn't known I needed. As I finished organizing the last of the paperwork, Paige appeared in the doorway with a steaming mug of tea. "Honey and lemon," she said, handing it to me. "After all those calls, you'll need it." I wrapped my hands around the cup, the warmth sinking in, and let the sound of Baxter's paws on the hardwood steady me. But peace didn't last long. A heavy pounding rattled the apartment door, startling us both. My father's voice boomed from the hallway, calling my name. Paige gestured for me to stay back, but I was already moving. Some confrontations are unavoidable, and this one had been waiting since the night I walked away. The pounding shook the doorframe, each strike louder than the last. "Nora," my father's voice thundered from the hall. "Open this door right now." My hands tightened around the mug of tea Paige had given me only minutes earlier. She motioned for me to stay back, but my feet carried me forward anyway. I knew this confrontation had been building since the moment I walked out of their house. Through the peephole, I saw his face, flushed red eyes narrowed in fury. His fist hammered the wood again, and the door shuddered under the force. "You think you can just abandon your family and ruin our lives?" His voice carried down the hallway, loud enough for neighbors to hear. A door across the hall opened. Mrs. Whitaker, her robe pulled close at the neck, peered out. "Young man," she called, her voice trembling but firm. "I've already called building security." Gerald whipped around, his glare cutting toward her. "Mind your business, lady. This is between me and my daughter." She didn't flinch. "Your behavior is my business when it disturbs the peace." Her door closed with a decisive click, leaving my father alone with his anger echoing in the corridor. Then came the crash, his boot slamming against the door, splintering the wood around the lock. I stumbled back, phone in hand, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. My voice stayed steady as I gave the dispatcher our address, even as the pounding grew louder. Paige stood at my side, her face pale, her hand gripping my arm. Moments later, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway. "Sir, step away from the door immediately." The voice of the security guard cut through the noise. My father spun toward him, his arms raised, shouting about his rights and his daughter. Then the sharp wail of approaching sirens filtered up from the street below. By the time 2 officers appeared, Gerald's anger had reached a fever pitch. Through the peephole, I watched as they pulled his arms behind his back and snapped cuffs around his wrists. He shouted over his shoulder, insisting I was destroying the family, insisting none of this was his fault. His words grew fainter as they led him toward the elevator, his voice swallowed by the silence that followed. When Officer Alvarez returned to take my statement, I opened the door at last. He stepped inside, surveying the cracked frame and splintered wood. I handed him the folder. I had been keeping receipts, accounts, statements, proof of bills I had paid, proof of the login attempts on my bank accounts. He flipped through the documents, his brows drawing together. "Would you like to press charges for attempted break-in?" he asked. The words hung between us, heavier than I expected. Paige gave me a small nod from the couch. My throat tightened, but my answer was clear. "Yes," I said softly. "And I'd like to file for a restraining order." Later that evening, Lucas carried in a box of small security cameras he had picked up after his shift. "We'll set these up at the entry," he said, setting the box on the table. "Extra eyes, just in case." I nodded, helping him sort through the cords, grateful for the practical steps that made me feel less cornered. Baxter lay at my feet, his head pressed against my ankle, sensing what words couldn't reach. While Lucas adjusted the camera above the door, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan. "Mom took your laptop and camera, said they're collateral for what you owe." My chest went tight as I read it. Those 2 things had cost me more than $2,000. I typed back quickly. "Do you know where she took them?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Heard her on the phone with Parkway Pawn. She said she got $300 for both." I showed the message to Paige, anger rising fresh and hot. "Do you still have the receipts?" she asked. I nodded, already digging through the folder. Every purchase I'd made for tax records had been carefully documented, serial numbers included. Within the hour, I sat at the kitchen table while Officer Patel took my theft report. She handled the receipts with care, her pen scratching across the form. "Pawning someone else's property is a criminal offense," she explained gently. "We'll contact the shop and recover your items." For the first time in months, the system I had always assumed would dismiss me was working in my favor. That night, as I sat back against the couch, my phone filled with new messages. Some came from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, their tones softer now. Word of my father's outburst had spread through the building, neighbors retelling what they had witnessed. Aunt Sarah's voice cracked on a voicemail, apologizing for believing the version of events she'd been told. "We had no idea things were this bad," she said. The shift in the story felt strange, like light hitting a surface I hadn't realized was reflective. By the time I finished mounting the second camera with Lucas, another message appeared from my mother. Her words rolled across the screen, blunt and dismissive. "Had to pawn your camera and laptop to cover the electric bill you left us with. Parkway Pawn on 4th Street. You owe me 300 plus interest." I passed the phone to Paige, who shook her head slowly. "The delusion is impressive," she muttered, handing it back. I saved the message as evidence, not because I planned to argue, but because every word mattered now. As I sat at the table with the folder spread open again, I realized this wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about drawing lines that couldn't be erased. The splintered wood at the doorframe was still visible, and the cameras above the entry blinked with their small red lights. For once, I wasn't the one under watch. This time, I was the one watching. Still, I knew it wasn't finished. 3 days later, my phone rang again. My mother's number flashed across the screen, and I felt the weight of what was coming. When I answered, her voice carried the rehearsed tone I had heard too many times before. "Blair," she began, "I've been thinking. If you drop that theft report, you can come back home. Your room is still there just as you left it." I sat in silence, letting her fill the gap. "And your father and I, we think it's time to discuss your state of mind. People would understand a breakdown better than these claims you're making." Her meaning was clear. Drop the charges or be painted as unstable. I pressed my palm against the folder on the table, feeling the weight of the bills, the receipts, the messages, and the months of proof that had brought me here. My voice was steady when I answered. "I have copies of every bill I've paid, bank statements showing transfers to your account, texts about cosmetic procedures you claimed were medical. Would you like me to present all of that?" The silence on the line told me enough. The following morning, I drove behind Officer Patel's cruiser, the flash of her taillights guiding me back toward the house I had left days earlier. Her presence was deliberate, a visible reminder that I wasn't returning alone. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed curtains shift in neighboring windows, curious eyes tracking every step. The cruiser in front of my parents' home said what words could not. I wasn't here to argue, I was here to retrieve what was mine. Carla answered the door, her smile brittle when she saw the officer. "Mrs. Hayes," Officer Patel greeted, her tone even. "I'm here to accompany Nora while she collects her belongings." My mother stepped aside reluctantly, arms folded tight across her chest. The air inside felt heavier than I remembered, as if the walls themselves were waiting for conflict. I walked directly to my room with Officer Patel close behind. The space looked almost untouched, though I knew better. I pulled the folder from my bag and handed it to the officer. Inside were copies of every bill I had covered, each stapled to proof of payment. Utilities, groceries, medical expenses, even the refrigerator receipt from July. She flipped through the pages slowly, her eyebrows lifting. "You paid for all of this while living here?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady. "For the past 6 months. Carla appeared in the doorway, her face stiff. "That furniture belongs to this family." She said, her chin raised. "You can't just take everything." I reached into the folder and held up another stack of receipts. "I have proof for every item I said," offering them to the officer. Patel studied them carefully before turning back to my mother. "These records are clear. Nora purchased these items with her own funds." For the first time, Carla had no words. She stepped back, retreating down the hallway without another glance. I packed methodically books and clothes into boxes I had brought from Pages. The desk I assembled during the pandemic, the bookshelf, even the bedding from my first paycheck, all came with me. Through the window, I could see neighbors standing on porches, some pretending to water plants or sort mail. Let them watch. Let them see the truth I had carried in silence for too long. When I carried the last box toward the door, the sound of an engine made me freeze. My second car, the one I had left parked safely at Page's building, rolled into the driveway. My father stepped out, keys dangling from his hand. His expression was smug as he approached. "We need to discuss what you owe us before you take this too," he said, gesturing toward the vehicle I was about to drive. I set the box down and pulled a document folder from my purse. "This is the title," I said, holding up the paper. "And this is the registration. Both are in my name." Officer Patel stepped forward, her voice firm. "Mr. Hayes, this vehicle is registered to Nora. Please hand over the keys." The color drained from his face, but his grip on the keys tightened. "I paid for her braces. Her schooling, 18 years of the keys." Mr. Hayes Patel interrupted, extending her hand. Slowly his fingers opened, and the metal dropped into her palm. She turned and placed them in my hand. In that moment, I saw something I had never seen before: my father's complete deflation. The man who had towered over our family for decades looked smaller than I had ever known him to be. I met his eyes. "Come near me or my property again, and I'll file for a restraining order." My voice didn't shake. I walked past him, slid into the driver's seat, and adjusted the mirror. As the engine turned over, I caught sight of the neighbors again, no longer pretending. Mrs. Henderson across the street stood openly on her lawn, phone in hand, documenting everything. As I pulled onto the road, the house shrank in the mirror. On the porch, Megan stood in the doorway, her hand raised in a tentative wave. Her face held both sorrow and something else, admiration maybe, or the hope of strength she hadn't yet claimed for herself. 3 blocks away, I reached a red light. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. It was a message from Megan. "They're blaming me now," it read. "What do I do?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared as if she couldn't decide whether to say more. I kept my foot on the brake as the light turned green, the screen glowing in my hand. For the first time, I realized she was now standing exactly where I had once stood, alone in a house where silence meant survival, waiting to decide which way her life would turn. Sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains of my new apartment, scattering patterns across the hardwood floors I had chosen myself. The air carried a stillness that was different from silence. It was the sound of space I controlled entirely. 3 months had passed since I drove away from my parents' house, and the rhythm of my days was finally beginning to steady. I ran my hand over the desk where neatly stacked envelopes waited: electricity, water, internet, renter's insurance, all addressed to me alone. Each bill was modest, manageable, and proof of a balance I hadn't known was possible. The first time I paid them from my own account, I sat at the table a long while, letting the weight of it sink in. No arguments, no guilt, no fear of whose name might appear on the disconnect notice. My bank balance, once drained, now grew bit by bit each month. The goal I had set, 6 months of savings tucked away, was only a third complete, but the progress was visible, steady. Even small deposits felt like milestones. Independence showed up in little things, too. I painted the wall behind my bed a deep teal, a color my mother would have called impractical. I left it that way without explanation, and each morning it greeted me as a choice I had made without permission. On weekends, I picked up secondhand pieces, a mismatched set of plates, a table worn smooth from years of use. Nothing matched perfectly, but everything belonged to me. The first Thanksgiving in my own place came quickly. The apartment was smaller than the house I had left, but the warmth inside grew as I slid a golden turkey onto the table I had polished the night before. The irony of hosting didn't escape me, but it was different this time. Paige brought rolls still warm from the oven, and Lucas carried in a pot of potatoes he had mashed in his own kitchen. Megan hovered near the counter, unsure of her role, until I handed her the serving spoon. "Your company is enough," I told her when she asked what else she could do. She smiled, then a quiet relief settling over her shoulders. We sat close together, dishes crowded onto the table, laughter rising and falling in rhythm with the clink of silverware. The toast came from Paige, her glass lifted high. To found family and boundaries worth keeping. Our glasses touched, and for the first time in years, I felt the words fit. Megan's confidence was growing since she had started her first semester at college. I had helped her fill out financial aid forms and housing applications, the kind of work that once consumed me alone. Watching her settle into a life outside our parents' house brought me a quiet pride, even when her late-night calls carried the nervousness of exams or new roommates. She was learning to stand where I once could not. Later that weekend, she sat with me at my kitchen counter, surrounded by scholarship applications, spread wide across the surface. Her handwriting trailed off as she spoke. "They lost the house last month," she said quietly. "Dad's blaming the bank, the economy, anyone but himself. They're staying with Uncle Rick, but he's already telling them to find their own place." Her pen tapped against the paper as she looked down. "They still blame you, though." I nodded, glancing at the shelf nearby where a row of unopened envelopes sat. 5 letters, all from my parents, each one stacked in order of arrival. Their handwriting stared back at me, familiar and untouched. I hadn't opened any of them. Boundaries meant silence, too, and sometimes silence was the hardest choice of all. Megan's words lingered. "They're just facing what would have happened anyway," she said, her eyes on the forms between us. "Your money only postponed it." She didn't mean it as comfort, but it landed that way. I highlighted a section of the housing assistance form for her and pushed it back across the counter. "Start here," I told her. She nodded, her shoulders easing as she bent back to the page. The balance of my life continued in its small, steady ways. I cooked dinners for myself, sometimes for Paige and Lucas too, and laughed when Baxter thumped his tail against the cabinet doors in anticipation. I bought a rug for the living room, softer than it looked, and sat cross-legged on it with a mug of tea, feeling the weight of a day well lived. There were no sudden revelations, only the slow rebuilding of ground I could stand on without fear of it giving way. Still, the unopened letters remained. Some nights when the apartment was quiet, I caught myself staring at them, wondering whether distance was enough or if the past would always reach forward, asking for some reply. The first letter I opened came on a Friday evening. I sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea, the stack of envelopes finally too heavy to ignore. The handwriting was my mother's, neat but pressed harder than usual, the ink faintly indented into the paper. The words carried her familiar rhythm, pleading at first, then shifting into blame. She wrote that my absence had left them in ruins, that the utilities were overdue, that Gerald's arrest had humiliated them. Beneath it all, the tone was clear. I owed them restoration, not boundaries. 2 days later, Officer Patel called with an update. The pawned laptop and camera had been recovered, returned to me with the serial numbers matched against my receipts. She sounded almost pleased when she said the charges against my mother were being reviewed by the district attorney. "You've kept meticulous records," she added almost as reassurance. I thanked her quietly, grateful my habit of saving every document had become a shield I hadn't known I would need. That week, the calls from my parents intensified. When I let them ring through, the messages turned sharper. Carla's voice grew desperate, alternating between soft apologies and harsh accusations. Gerald's messages were shorter, demanding repayment, threatening to contest ownership of items already proved mine. I saved each recording in a folder on my phone, the same way I had done with bills and receipts. It wasn't anger that drove me anymore, but a need for evidence. Megan visited the following weekend, her textbooks piled into a tote bag she set on my kitchen floor. She watched me sort the returned items back onto my desk. "Mom said you stole those," she murmured, almost as if repeating it made her complicit. I looked up, and she shook her head quickly. "I don't believe her. I just wanted you to know what they're saying." I nodded, not surprised. The story my parents told had always bent toward their version of truth. She sat with me at the table, filling out scholarship forms as I entered bills into my budget. "Uncle Rick's getting tired of them," she said after a long silence. "He told them to find their own place by spring." Her words were quiet, but I could hear the weariness in them. "They keep saying if you'd just come home, everything would be fine again." I set my pen down and folded the latest bank statement carefully. "Things won't ever be the same," I said. She didn't argue. By early March, the restraining order hearing was scheduled. Officer Alvarez met me outside the courthouse, guiding me through the process with calm assurance. Gerald's attempt to force entry at Paige's apartment was detailed in the report, alongside the photos of the broken lock and Mrs. Whitaker's written statement. I sat in the courtroom steady as the judge read through the evidence. My father's voice, usually booming, was subdued that day. He tried to frame his actions as concern for a daughter he feared was unstable. But the stack of documents I presented, the recordings of his threats, the receipts, and the police reports, told another story. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting the restraining order for a full year, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Gerald left the courtroom without meeting my eyes, Carla trailing behind him. For the first time, I walked out not as someone leaving under their shadow, but as someone protected by the truth. The shift spread beyond the courtroom. Calls from extended family slowed after the ruling became known. A cousin reached out quietly saying they hadn't realized how much I had been carrying. Aunt Phyllis, once so vocal, fell silent. It seemed the image my parents had crafted was cracking in places they could no longer repair. One evening as I was preparing dinner, Paige leaned against the counter watching me stir sauce over the stove. "You seem lighter," she said, her tone gentle. I thought about it before answering. "It feels like the balance is finally changing." She smiled, setting plates on the table. "About time," she said. That weekend, Megan joined us for dinner again. Between bites of pasta, she told me her latest grades and the part-time job she had picked up at the campus library. She laughed when Baxter dropped his head in her lap, begging for scraps. Later, when we washed dishes together, she leaned closer. "They've been asking about you again," she said. But I didn't answer this time. Her eyes met mine steady for once. "I'm tired of being caught between them." I dried the last plate and set it in the cupboard. "You don't have to choose sides," I told her. "You only have to choose yourself." She nodded, her reflection wavering in the kitchen window as the evening darkened outside. The months ahead promised more challenges my parents wouldn't stop pressing, not while they believed they could still control the story. But for the first time, I felt the ground beneath me hold firm. The receipts, the records, the testimony, all of it had shifted the weight from defense to proof. What had once been silence and fear was becoming something else, a foundation for justice. The months that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. My apartment grew into a place that reflected me warm light through the curtains, books arranged on shelves I built myself, and a quiet that felt safe instead of lonely. Each bill I paid, each deposit into savings became a small reminder of balance restored. The life I carried on my own shoulders for so long was finally mine to shape. Megan visited often, slipping into the chair by my table with stories from her classes and updates on her part-time job at the library. She was learning to navigate her own independence, and I watched her gain confidence in each decision she made. Sometimes while sorting through her scholarship forms together, she would glance at me with that same mix of gratitude and resolve I once felt toward her. The difference now was that she didn't have to stand alone. She had a path that wasn't bound by the silence of our old house. News of my parents drifted in through her visits. Gerald and Carla moved from place to place after Uncle Rick grew weary of their presence. The house they had clung to for so long was gone, lost to foreclosure. They tried to blame on everyone but themselves. Their attempts to call or send letters grew less frequent after the restraining order, though I still kept the unopened envelopes lined on a shelf. They sat there like chapters I had chosen not to read, reminders of a past that no longer defined my present. On the first anniversary of leaving, I hosted a dinner again. This time the table was fuller. Paige and Lucas brought dishes Megan carried in a pie, and even Mrs. Whitaker stopped by with a plate of cookies. We sat close, mismatched chairs pulled around the table, laughter rising in easy waves. Baxter nudged his head against my knee, waiting patiently for scraps, and the sound of forks against plates mingled with voices that carried no judgment, no expectation. It felt like the kind of family I had longed for, built not by blood, but by choice. When the evening grew quiet and dishes were stacked high, I found myself watching Megan. She leaned back in her chair, her expression relaxed in a way I had rarely seen before. I realized then that the legacy of our family was no longer in the hands of those who had tried to control us. It rested in the strength we found by stepping outside their shadow. Looking back, the lesson is simple, but not easy. Love without respect is not love at all. Family without boundaries becomes a burden, and sometimes the greatest act of care is refusing to let yourself be erased. Walking away didn't end the story, it allowed a new one to begin, one written with dignity, steadiness, and the quiet joy of choosing peace. So, if you've ever carried more than your share or felt unseen in the place you called home, I hope my story reminds you that stepping into your own life is not abandonment, it's survival, it's strength, and sometimes it's the only way to discover the family you deserve. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever found strength in setting boundaries, let me know. And don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one.